Picture this. You bury your mother on a Tuesday. By Friday, there's a bulldozer tearing up the forest your great-grandfather planted in 1885. Not a mistake. Not a misunderstanding. The HOA president, let's call her Diane, pulls up in her white Lexus, window down, smirking. She waves a construction permit at me like it's a royal decree. 12 luxury villas. $4 million in value. On my land. Most people would have called the cops that day, gotten an injunction, filed a restraining order, stopped them cold. But not me. I did the opposite. I let Diane and her crew pour every foundation, frame every wall, install every marble countertop and infinity pool, right up to 95% completion. And then, when they were weeks from cutting the ribbon, I walked into court with a deed older than Diane's great-grandparents. And I took it all. My name's Eli Brennan, 47 years old. Photographer by trade. Divorced, because my ex-wife once said I never react fast enough. She wasn't wrong. I'm methodical. Surveyors measure twice, cut once. And when someone steals from you, sometimes patience is the sharpest weapon you've got. The land we're talking about? 18 acres of mixed hardwood forest in Shenandoah County, Virginia, a stretch of quiet woods bordered by a crumbling stone wall and a creek that whispers even in drought. My mother used to call it our living history. She taught me to use a camera under those trees, back when I was 10 and light leaked through the leaves like stained glass. That forest wasn't just property. It was bloodline. The day after the funeral, I stood by her grave. The smell of turned earth still fresh. And in the distance, a low metallic roar. When I reached the ridge, I saw yellow machines cutting into the slope. Diesel smoke mixed with pine dust. A man in a neon vest waved at me like I was trespassing on my own soil. Diane arrived soon after, perfectly pressed suit, manicured smile. Mr. Brennan, she said, you'll be happy to know the new development will raise everyone's property values. Our community deserves an upgrade. I remember staring at her, trying to understand how someone could be that confident while standing on another person's grave. I didn't yell. Didn't threaten. Didn't call the sheriff. Instead, I reached for my camera and started taking pictures. Each click was a record, of arrogance, of theft, of patience beginning to boil. In the following days, the machines multiplied. They cut access roads, flattened the ridge, poured concrete into forms that once held roots. The workers avoided eye contact. They probably assumed the paperwork was clean, that I'd already lost. They were wrong. That night, I drove back with a flashlight and walked the boundary line, the same one my great-grandfather had marked with stacked stones a century ago. Those stones still stood, half buried under moss, right where the survey map from 1887 said they'd be. And that was when I decided, I wasn't going to stop them. Not yet. Let them build. Let them invest. Let them believe they'd already won. Every brick they laid would become evidence. Every nail they drove would drive my claim deeper. They thought silence meant surrender. They didn't realize silence can also mean strategy. I stood under the skeletal frame of the first villa as the wind hissed through unfinished beams. The moonlight fell across the half-built marble steps like a warning. I whispered to my mother's memory, "Don't worry, Ma. They'll finish every inch of what they started. And then, I'll take it back. Because patience isn't weakness. Sometimes, it's revenge wearing a quiet face." The next week, I watched the project come alive like a parasite feeding on memory. Trucks roared in and out. Survey flags fluttered where maples once stood. Every dawn brought new noise, drills, hammers, voices calling measurements over the sound of engines. It was surreal. The forest I'd known since childhood had become a construction site with security guards and private property, HOA development, signs nailed to my trees. Most people in my position would have panicked. But I'm not most people. I'm deliberate. I measure before I move. So instead of fighting the storm, I started taking notes. I photographed every delivery truck, every permit number printed on the side of a trailer. I mapped where they dug, what dates concrete was poured, when utilities were connected. I even logged weather reports, rain days, dry spells, frost lines. It looked obsessive, maybe even crazy. But in property disputes, details are currency. And I was quietly getting rich. The HOA held a community meeting about the villas at Brookline Ridge. Diane ran the show like a politician, calm, polished, performing sincerity. She stood beneath a PowerPoint slide showing digital renderings of luxury homes. 12 modern villas with sustainable design and exclusive amenities, she said, smiling as though the crowd were already applauding. They clapped, of course. They always did. Most of them didn't even realize part of that land wasn't legally theirs to vote on. I sat in the back row, hands clasped, listening. When she noticed me, her smile flickered just a little. "Mr. Brennan," she said sweetly, "you'll be pleased to know your property will benefit tremendously from this improvement." I gave her the smallest nod, the kind that looks like agreement but really means, "I'm taking notes on your arrogance." A few days later, I met one of the site contractors, a man named Fletcher, at a local diner. Over coffee, I asked harmless questions. "How's the work going?" He shrugged. "They're cutting corners. Permits came through too fast. We didn't even get final inspections yet." I bought him a refill and stored that sentence in my mental vault. By mid-July, the villas had frames, roofs, and glass walls reflecting sunlight like mirrors. Diane brought investors to tour the site, champagne in plastic cups, designer sunglasses, laughter echoing off half-finished walls. I stood just far enough away to take a picture. The caption in my head read, "Exhibit A, Premature Celebration." At home, my dining table turned into a war room. Old survey maps lay beside new blueprints. My laptop screen showed satellite images of the property line, compared year by year. I kept everything labeled and time-stamped. Evidence doesn't need anger, it needs order. One evening, my sister Naomi came by. She's younger, sharper, less patient than me. "Eli," she said, staring at the piles of papers, "why haven't you stopped them yet?" "Because," I said quietly, "they haven't finished hanging themselves." She frowned. "And what if they don't?" I smiled. "They already have. They just don't know it yet." It's funny how confidence blinds people. Diane was so certain she could outsmart a man who measures for a living. She thought paperwork was power. But she didn't know that I'd spent my life studying the kind of precision that doesn't forgive mistakes. A single miscopied number can destroy a fortune. A missing signature can erase a year of work. So while they built, I searched for flaws. And soon enough, I found one. Buried in the county's public records, there was a notarized easement document, except it wasn't actually notarized. The page where the seal should have been was blank. Someone had forgotten to finalize it. One missing stamp. One legal fracture. It was small, microscopic even, but in court, it would be nuclear. That night, I stood at the edge of the site again. The villas glowed under floodlights, almost complete. The smell of cut wood drifted in the cool air. I whispered to the empty forest, "Keep building, Diane. Build faster." Because patience, I'd learned, doesn't just wait. It sharpens. The deeper I dug, the clearer it became, this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was theft dressed in paperwork. Diane and her developer friend, Carter Hayes, had used charm and technical jargon to hide greed under a mountain of legalese. But what they didn't expect was that I'd grown up reading maps older than their HOA. I spent nights hunched over my dining table, cross-referencing property surveys from 1887, 1912, 1954, each one hand-drawn, each one slightly different. But all of them told the same story: the ridge line, the oak grove, the brook that cut through our woods, it was all Brennan land. Always had been. Still, I needed proof. Something undeniable. So I went searching where most people never think to look, the county archives. The place smelled of dust and history. Old boxes stacked in uneven towers, labels faded from decades of sun and neglect. A clerk led me to the records basement, back corner, under historical deeds, she said, yawning. It took me hours, maybe days, I lost track. Then I found it. A long, narrow box tied with rotting twine. Inside lay a folded sheet wrapped in oilcloth, the kind my great-grandfather used to protect his papers. When I opened it, the world seemed to stop breathing. There it was, the original deed, dated 1891. The ink had browned, the paper brittle, but the signature was unmistakable, Ezekiel Brennan. The description was poetic in its precision. From the third granite stone by the North Brook to the beach split by lightning, and thence to the ridge marked by 12 maples planted in faith and remembrance. That last line, in faith and remembrance, hit me like a hammer. Those 12 maples still stood. Or they had, before the bulldozers came. I traced my fingers over the seal. It wasn't just nostalgia anymore, it was ammunition. When I showed the document to the county clerk, his eyebrows shot up. This predates the county's zoning registry, he said, almost whispering. It's legitimate. It was filed under the old land charter, never rescinded. The ownership's clear. He made certified copies, stamped each page with official seals. I walked out of that office holding more power than Diane ever imagined I could have. That night, I called my sister Naomi. You were right about Grandpa's stories, I said. She was quiet for a moment. You found it, didn't you? Yeah. The land never left us. They just stopped remembering. For the first time since Mom's funeral, I slept without dreaming of bulldozers. But morning brought clarity, I couldn't just rely on sentiment. I needed a strategy. The HOA's developers had already built millions worth of property. If I struck too soon, they'd bury me in injunctions and appeals. I had to time it perfectly. So I watched them keep going. By early fall, the villas were nearly finished. Shiny black roofs, glass balconies, landscaped paths lined with imported stone. The workers were installing fixtures now, chandeliers, faucets, security systems. Diane strutted through the site like a queen inspecting her castle. She didn't see me parked on the ridge, camera in hand. I zoomed in and took a photo, her laughing beside Carter, champagne glass raised against the sunlight. A perfect picture of confidence. A perfect exhibit for the day I'd ruin her. Over the next few weeks, I gathered more records, transaction receipts, HOA meeting minutes, and one particularly damning document, a development bond signed under a parcel number that didn't exist. That was the nail in the coffin. They'd built half a fortune on land that wasn't legally theirs, and they'd recorded it under the wrong number. The law doesn't move fast, but when it does, it cuts deep. So I waited for them to finish every last tile, every railing, every light bulb. Because the closer they got to completion, the more satisfying the collapse would be. And the more undeniable my proof became. By the time the last villa got its paint and landscaping, autumn had set in. The Shenandoah trees burned gold and red, and the air smelled like endings. Diane didn't know it yet, but her empire was days away from collapse. I walked into the county courthouse on a Monday morning. Not with rage. With purpose. The clerk recognized me. You're here about the Brennan property case. Yeah, I said, sliding the folder across the counter. Deed, survey, historical filings, and every record of unauthorized construction. He flipped through the stack, eyes widening with every page. You have everything. Everything, I said. Even the part where they signed a development bond on a non-existent parcel. He gave a slow whistle. This is going to make waves. By noon, the petition for injunction was filed. By Wednesday, the county sheriff had taped a bright orange "Stop Work" order across every villa gate. When Diane saw it, she lost her smile. I was there, watching from the hill. She ripped the notice down and shouted at the workers. Carter Hayes stormed out of the model villa, tie half loose, face red. He pointed toward my truck. "He's the one. He's behind this." I didn't move. Just leaned against the door, calm as winter stone. 2 days later, we met in court. Diane arrived first, white suit, designer bag, an army of lawyers trailing behind her like shadows. She gave me that same smirk from months ago. But her eyes flickered when she saw my binder, thick, labeled, organized. The judge, an old man with kind eyes and little patience, looked between us. "Mr. Brennan, you're claiming ownership of the land these structures occupy?" "Yes, Your Honor. The deed's been in my family since 1891. It was never transferred, sold, or subdivided." Her lawyer stood. "Your Honor, this land was acquired legally through the HOA's development partner. All permits were approved." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Approved on what parcel?" The lawyer hesitated, shuffled papers. "Parcel 142B. I smiled. "There is no parcel 142B. It was dissolved in 1978 when the county redrew the grid. I have the map to prove it." I slid the document forward. The courtroom went still. The judge studied it, then looked up at Diane. "Mrs. Sharp, did you or your contractors verify ownership before breaking ground?" She stammered. We had authorization from the board." "Authorization," the judge cut in, "doesn't override ownership." Her lawyers began whispering furiously, flipping pages. I stood silent. The judge turned to me. "Mr. Brennan, you said you allowed them to continue construction despite knowing this?" "Yes, Your Honor. I wanted them to finish." A murmur spread across the courtroom. The judge frowned. "Why?" I looked straight at Diane. "Because if I'd stopped them early, they'd claim damages for lost materials. But now, the villas are complete, and every brick, every window, every tile was built on my land. By law, that makes them mine." The silence that followed was almost sacred. The judge leaned back, thoughtful. "He's correct. Under Virginia property statutes, unauthorized improvements revert to the rightful landowner. The HOA has no claim." Diane's face drained of color. Carter whispered something harsh in her ear, but she just stared at the table, eyes unfocused. When the gavel came down, it was like thunder. Judgment in favor of Mr. Eli Brennan. The court recognizes full ownership of the property and all existing structures upon it. Just like that, 12 luxury villas, for $1 million worth of arrogance, belonged to me. As I walked out, Diane followed, her voice trembling. "You can't do this. You'll ruin families. Investments." I turned back, calm. "You ruined my mother's forest. I'm just reclaiming what was never yours." Then I walked away. For the first time in months, I could breathe. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. Power doesn't surrender quietly. Winning in court should have felt like fireworks. But when the verdict came down, all I felt was stillness. The kind that comes after a long storm. The kind that lets you finally hear yourself breathe. I drove back to the ridge that evening, parked by what used to be my mother's favorite oak tree. The leaves had turned bronze and crisp, crunching under my boots. From up there, I could see the 12 villas, their glass walls catching the dying light, perfect and hollow. They were beautiful. Too beautiful for what they represented. A week later, my lawyer called. "It's done. The court orders recorded. Title transferred." They tried to appeal, but the judge denied it. "You own everything now. Everything. But everything felt like a strange word when your mother's forest was gone, when the air no longer smelled like pine and rain. The first days after the ruling, Diane vanished from the neighborhood. Carter Hayes, her developer friend, was on the news, bankrupt, investors suing, assets frozen. The HOA board disbanded quietly. Their fancy entrance signs came down, the flower beds went wild. Justice, on paper, was complete. But I didn't celebrate. Not yet. I spent those next few weeks walking the land, my land, documenting what was left. The old boundary stones. The creek that still whispered through the ruins of roots. And in the middle of it all, a small clearing where 12 stumps stood in a perfect line. The maples. My great-grandfather's faith and remembrance. I stood there for a long time, the wind cutting through the quiet. Then I made a decision. The villas would stay, for now. I wasn't interested in demolition or profit. The world had enough of both. I wanted restoration. Meaning. So I listed them, not for sale, but for lease to veterans, single parents, and local families who'd been priced out of the county by the same kind of greed that fueled Diane's dream. Every lease was one more act of reclamation, not just of land, but of purpose. When the first tenants moved in, a young nurse and her daughter, I handed them the keys myself. She looked around, wide-eyed. "This place is incredible. Why would you rent it so cheap?" I smiled. Because it was built on something that didn't belong to them. Now it belongs to people who need it. That night, I walked back up to the ridge, watching the villa lights flicker on below. Not as symbols of arrogance anymore, but of life returning to the ground it came from. Naomi called. "You okay?" "Yeah," I said quietly. "Better than I've been in years." She paused. "You ever going to tell people what you did?" "Maybe," I said. "Or maybe I'll just let the story spread on its own. Because stories have a way of finding their way into the right hands, especially the ones about patience, justice, and the slow burn of revenge." A month later, a letter arrived from the county, an invitation to speak at the Historical Society about the preservation of ancestral land. I almost laughed. From forgotten son to landowner, from lost to legacy. As I folded the letter, I glanced out at the horizon, autumn fading, winter creeping in. I thought about my mother, my grandfather, and the 12 maples that once marked this ground. I planted 12 new saplings that week. Each one named after the family who would live in the villas below. Because land, like memory, isn't about possession. It's about continuity, the quiet knowing that what was once taken can be made whole again. And as I stood there, soil on my hands, I realized something simple. Revenge is sweet. But rebuilding is sacred.